from the internet into the model. Now we have a second stage that's reinforcement learning or test time compute or reasoning or whatever you want to call it. I think of it as a second stage that involves reinforcement learning. Now both of those things are scaling up together, as we've seen with our models and as we've seen with models from other companies. And I don't see anything blocking that, the further scaling of that. There's some stuff about, how do we broaden the tasks? On the RL side of it, we've seen more progress on, say, math and code, where the models are, getting pretty close to like a high professional level, and less on more subjective tasks. But I think that is very much a temporary obstacle. So when I look at it, I see this exponential and I say, look, people aren't very good at making sense of exponentials, right? Like, if something is doubling every 6 months, then 2 years before it happens, it looks like it's only 1/16 of the way there. And so we are. So my view of this has always been that talent is the most important thing. So if you go back 3 years ago, we were in a position where we had raised mere hundreds of millions. OpenAI had already raised $13 billion from Microsoft, and of course the large hypercap tech companies were sitting on $100 billion, $200 billion. And basically the pitch we made then is, we know how to make these models better than others do, right? There may be a curve of scaling laws, but look, if we are in a position where we can do for 100 million what others can do for $1 billion, and we could do for 10 billion what they can do for 100 billion, then it's 10 times more capital efficient to invest in Anthropic than it is to invest in these other companies. Would you rather be in a position where you can do anything for 10 times cheaper, or where you start with a large pile of money? If you can do things 10 times cheaper, the money is a temporary defect, providing a given level of intelligence to go down. I expect the price of providing the frontier of intelligence, which will provide kind of increasing economic value, that might go up or it might go down. My guess is it probably stays about where it is. But again, the value that's created, goes way up. So 2 years from now, my guess is that we'll have models that cost of the same order of magnitude that they cost today, except they'll be much more capable of doing work much more autonomously, much more broadly than they are capable of today.
One of the things that Amjad mentioned was he thinks that the bigger models are not as intensive to run, or more intensive to run, given their size, because of the architecture and some of these techniques that we talked about, that they're lighting up only certain sections of the model. So his idea, I'm hopefully conveying this truthfully, is that Anthropic can run these models without too much bulk on the back end, but is still keeping those prices where they are. And I think the line that I'm going to draw there is maybe that to get to software margins, there were some reports that Anthropic is slightly below software gross margins. You're going to have to charge a little bit more for these models. So
again, I think larger models cost more to run than smaller models.
Okay.
I think the technique you're referring to is maybe mixture of experts or something like that. Yep. So whether your models are mixture of experts or not, like mixture of experts is like a way to run models more cheaply that have a given number of parameters. It's a way to train models. But if you're not using that technique, then larger models that don't use that technique cost more to run than smaller models that don't use that technique. And if you're using that technique, larger models that use that technique cost more to run than smaller models that are using that technique. So I think that's sort of a distortion of the situation.
Basically, I'm just guessing, and I'm trying to find out what the truth is from you. So.
Yeah. Look. So I. In terms of like the cost of the models, like one thing you'd be surprised by, people kind of impute this thing to like, oh man, it's going to be really hard to get the margins from like X% to Y%. We make improvements all the time that make the models like 50% more efficient than they are before. We're just at the beginning of optimizing inference. Inference has improved a huge amount from where it was a couple years ago to where it is now. That's why the prices are coming down.
And then how long is it going to take to be profitable? Because I think the loss is going to be like $3 billion this year. That's what they predict.
So I would distinguish different things.
Okay.
There's the cost of running the model, right? So for every dollar the model makes, it costs a certain amount. That is actually already fairly profitable. There are separate things. There's, the cost of paying people. There are separate things. There's, the cost of paying people and like buildings. That is actually not that large in the scheme of things. The big cost is the cost of training the next model. And I think this idea of like the companies losing money and not being profitable it's a little bit misleading. And you start to understand it better when you look at the scaling laws. So as a thought exercise, these numbers are not exact or even close for Anthropic. Let's imagine that in 2023, you train a model that costs $100 million. And then in 2024, you deploy the 2023 model and it makes $200 million in revenue, but you spend $1 billion to train, to train a new model in 2024. So, and then in 2025, the $1 billion model makes $2 billion in revenue, and you spend $10 billion to train the next model. So the company every year is unprofitable. It lost $800 million in 2024, and then in 2025, it lost $8 billion. So this looks like a hugely unprofitable enterprise. But if instead, I think in terms of is each model profitable?
Right, and I could have this wrong, but one thing I heard was that his illness was largely uncurable when he had it, and there have been advances that have been. Can you share a little bit more?
Yes,
there are advances that have made it much more manageable today.
Yes, that is true. Actually, only in the maybe 3 or 4 years after he died, the cure rate for the disease that he had went from 50% to roughly 95%.
Yeah, I mean, it has to have felt so unjust to have your father taken away by something that could have been cured.
Of course. But it also tells you of the urgency of solving the relevant problems, right? That there was someone who worked on the cure to this disease that managed to cure it and save a bunch of people's lives, but could have saved even more people's lives if they had managed to find that this of AI ramps up, and it's ramping up exponentially. If I'm right, in a couple years, it'll be the biggest source of revenue in the world, right? It'll be the biggest industry in the world, and people who run companies already think it. So we actually have this terrifying situation where, hundreds of billions to trillions to, I would say maybe 20 trillion of capital is on the side of accelerate AI as fast as possible. We have this company that's very valuable in absolute terms, but, looks very small compared to that, right? $60 billion. And I keep speaking up, even if, it makes folks there have been these articles, some folks in the US government are upset at us, for example, for opposing the moratorium on AI regulation, for being in favor of export controls for chips on China, for talking about the economic impacts of AI. Every time I do that, I get attacked by many of my peers.
Right, but you're still assuming that we can control it. That's what I'm